Hello everybody. In the previous lesson, we discussed certain modal verbs. If you remember, can, could, may, might, must, and have to, but I promised you that in the next lesson we would discuss the rest of the modal verbs. Well, welcome to the next lesson. And in today's lesson, we are going to be discussing should, ought to, will, would, and need. So, let's get to it. Should and ought to are grammatical synonyms. And anytime you can use should, you can replace it with ought to. For example, in the phrase, I knew I ought to visit her. Well, I knew I should visit her. Or if I say, I knew I should have visited her, I can also say, I knew I ought to have visited her. Here, it's a one-to-one substitution. You substitute one exactly for the other. And let's examine ought to in a little bit more detail. Now, although should and ought to are grammatical synonyms, their meanings differ ever so slightly. So, beginning with ought to, we can use ought to refer to an obligation which is desired as it is advised or morally good or simply desirable. Like in the example, as my friend, you ought to help me, or medicine ought to be free of charge. In these cases, I'm saying that these are desirable things or that you're a good person if you do them. Now, we can also use ought to give advice, with the adverbs always, never, and usually quite often. For example, you ought to be careful on the road, or you always ought to be careful on the road. Ought to, followed by the perfect infinitive, expresses that the action was not fulfilled in the past. For example, you ought to have phoned me, or you ought to have chosen a better day for climbing. Here, because we say you ought to have, we know that whatever ought to have happened did not, which is why we're talking about it now. We also use ought to make suppositions with strong probabilities of being true. Like in the example, you ought to be comfortable in that chair, or there ought to be good movies at the cinema this weekend. In both of these, I'm saying that this is very likely true based on the current information that I have. I think it is very, very likely. Now, to express another meaning of advised, desirable obligations, there's another modal verb that we should be speaking about, and that is the modal verb should. So let's examine should in a little bit of detail, shall we? Now, first, we should mention that should is one of the most emotionally colored modal verbs. I can express a great variety of emotions using should. And we should remember that while we're looking at all of the different cases of usage. So, first, I can use should to express obligation, advised or desirable, as well as make recommendations. And let's look at some examples. First, you should watch this film in the cinema, and you should do it at once. Here, you should watch this film at the cinema means that I think it will be a much better experience for you if you go see it in the cinema. So that's what you should do. And you should do it at once means that I think something bad may happen, or something less good at least, will happen if you wait. So you should do it right now, at once. We should note that should with the perfect infinitive, just like ought to with the perfect infinitive, expresses past actions that did not happen. For example, you should have gone to bed long ago, and you should have informed me about this incident. Now, the construction of should followed by the perfect infinitive is very typical in communication between people of different social rank. For example, a boss talking to his employees, or a parent talking to their children. Should is also used in questions starting with why to give emotional color to the statement. For example, why should I do this? Or why should I go there instead of you? In this case, I'm not just saying why am I going there, but I'm really emphasizing why should it be me? Should is also used in subordinate clauses to express regret or surprise or even sorrow. Let's look at some examples of this. I'm sorry that you should have been waiting for me for so long. Here, I'm really wanting to express that I am truly sorry. And this construction is a little more common in British English, but it is still used. Now, the present form shall we use to get somebody's permission or advice or to get to know someone's opinion. For example, let's look at some cases. I've lost my key. What shall I do? As well as, how long shall I stay here? In this case, I'm wanting to know about things that affect the present or continue into the future. Now, sometimes the two forms are interchangeable. For example, if I say, how long should I stay here? But if I say, how long should I stay here, I'm asking for your suggestion. If I'm asking, how long shall I stay here, it's more like saying, how long will. It's a stronger statement. Now, need, moving on to another modal verb, is special because it has two forms, modal and regular. In its modal meaning, it can be used with reference to the present and future only in negative and interrogative sentences. In its regular form, it can be used in all tenses, past, present, and future. Now, if we're discussing the modal meaning of need, then we can talk about need as being necessity, right? But let's look at how this works in some examples. First, need I come tomorrow? Or need I clean it up? Here, what I'm saying is there a need for me? But I'm simply saying, need I clean it up? Now, this is talking about necessity at the present moment only in this case. Need I clean it up is right now. There is a mess at this moment, and I am asking, do I need to clean it? Or need I clean it? And need not, the negative form of the modal verb, or its short form needn't, is used to express the absence of an immediate need. Let's look at the example. We needn't book the table. This restaurant is not very popular in this season. Here, we needn't book the table means right now, at this second, there is no need for us to do it. But let's compare this to the general meaning of need. Here, in the regular meaning of need, I'm just saying that there is a general necessity, both in negative and affirmative sentences and questions. Let's look at some examples that use this. I don't need to visit her. She's already well. Or, do I need a visa to go to Romania? Here, the general meaning is talking about a general need. No, I don't need to visit her ever. She's already well. It's not just talking about the present moment. Now, the negative form of need, needn't, used in combination with the perfect infinitive, means that an undesired action was performed, and also that it was not necessary. Let's look at some examples. You needn't have woken me up so early in the morning. Here, I'm saying that it was not necessary to wake me up so early. I could have slept another 10 minutes. Also, you needn't have told me about it the second time. I understood the first. Here, I'm saying again that the second telling was unnecessary. I understood you quite all right the first time. Now, we should also talk about the phrase didn't need to, since we're talking about need. And the phrase didn't need to means that there was no necessity to do something. The listener or the speaker already knew about it and didn't complete the action. For example, in the phrases, "She didn't need to stay there longer," or "We didn't need to wait for the results." Here, it's saying that there was no need in the past. Because we're using didn't, right? There was no need in the past, and we are expressing it with didn't need to. Moving on to talk about will, we use will in the following ways. First, we can use will to make requests, like, "Will you turn the light on, please?" Here, and this is a very polite way of making requests, here I simply want you to turn the light on, so I say, "Will you please?" We also use it to express a desire or to make a suggestion to do something. Let's look at a couple of examples using this. "I'll help you," or "I'll help you get something to drink." Here, I'm saying that it's my intention. I will do it, or I will help you do it. We also use will to express habitual actions. And let's look at an example of how we do this. Kate is a very kind person. She will always help people if they need it. And here, many times, it's used in combination with a conditional statement. She will help people if they need it. And finally, we should mention would. Now, would, in this case, is a more polite version of will, and we just substitute it straight in. Now, let's look at some examples where we use would instead of will. First, "Would you bring it back, please?" Now, here, I could say, "Will you bring it back, please?" But if I say will, it sounds like I might be a little bit angry, depending on my intonation. Would sounds much kinder here. "Would you bring it back, please?" Next, "Would you mind me smoking?" Here, "would you mind" means, would you be against? Or do you have a problem with me smoking? If not, then I'll go ahead, but I want to make sure first. Would you mind me smoking? Next, "I would like to ask you a question." Here, it's a polite wish or a polite request. I would like to ask you a question. And generally in English, it is more polite to talk about ourselves first. I would like to ask you a question. Another example, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" Here, this is actually a case where I would not say will, because I don't know if you do or not. So here, because I'm not sure, I say would. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" And I'm simply offering you a cup of coffee. The next example, "He would go skating every weekend when he was a child." Here, I'm not using will because I'm talking about a habitual action in the past that no longer applies. And because it no longer applies, I cannot say will. I must say would. Now that's about it for all of the modal verbs that I wanted to share with you today. And they're a little bit more complicated than all of this, but this is enough basic info to get you started. So remember that there are some modal verbs, like should, which are never followed by the word to. For example, many students want to say should to do something. This is incorrect. Now you can say ought to if we remember, but should to is wrong. So remember when you can use to and when you can't. Now be sure to review this lesson and the previous because modal verbs are one of the most significant parts of English. But I'm sure that these will help you with your exams and with your future studies of the English language. See you next time.